Marcus Thompson gripped the steering wheel of bus 47 a little tighter as he watched 7-year-old Sophie Carter through his rearview mirror. For 3 weeks now, the same troubling pattern had repeated itself. While every other child on his route happily claimed their seats, Sophie remained standing in the aisle, her small hands clutching the metal rails until her knuckles turned white. The morning Colorado sun cast long shadows through the windows, illuminating the determination on her young face as she swayed with each turn, refusing to sit despite his gentle reminders. What Marcus discovered when he finally understood why this little girl couldn't bear to sit down would shake him to his core and have him racing to dial 911, uncovering a nightmare no child should ever endure. Before we dive deeper into Sophie's story, tell us where you're tuning in from today. Does this glimpse into her struggle already tug at your heart? If stories of courage and protection move you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Cedar Valley, Colorado, nestled against the majestic Rocky Mountains, embodied everything people imagined when they thought of small-town America. With a population just under 15,000, it was the kind of place where Main Street still featured locally owned shops, where the annual Harvest Festival brought the entire community together, and where people genuinely cared about their neighbors' well-being. The mountain air carried the scent of pine trees year-round, and the changing seasons painted the landscape in stunning palettes, from the brilliant golds of autumn aspens to the pristine whites of winter snow. Marcus Thompson had called Cedar Valley home for the past 22 years, moving here after completing his service as an emergency medical technician in Denver. The constant stress and trauma of city emergency services had taken its toll, and when his wife Sarah suggested they find somewhere quieter to raise their son Robert, Cedar Valley had seemed like the perfect choice. The mountains reminded him of his childhood in northern Colorado, and the community welcomed newcomers with open arms. After Sarah's unexpected passing from cancer 6 years ago, it was this same community that had rallied around Marcus and Robert, bringing casseroles, offering support, and helping them navigate their grief. Now at 48, Marcus had found his calling in an unexpected place, behind the wheel of Cedar Valley School District's Bus 47. What had started as a temporary job to have more flexible hours for his teenage son had evolved into something much more meaningful. Marcus discovered that his EMT training hadn't just taught him how to handle medical emergencies. It had honed his ability to read people, to notice when something wasn't quite right. These skills, combined with his naturally protective nature, made him exceptionally suited for ensuring the safety of the 42 children who rode his bus each day. His route through Cedar Valley took him from the newer subdivisions on the eastern edge of town, past the historic downtown district, and into the more modest neighborhoods near the river. He knew every pothole, every sharp turn, and most importantly, every child who stepped onto his bus. Marcus prided himself on creating an environment where kids felt safe and respected. He learned their names within the first week of school, remembered their birthdays, and made sure the older kids looked out for the younger ones. The morning routine had become second nature to Marcus. He'd wake at 5:30 a.m., brew his coffee in the same chipped mug Robert had made in 7th grade ceramics class, and review the weather forecast while eating toast with peanut butter. By 6:15, he was at the depot, conducting his pre-trip inspection. With military precision, checking tire pressure, testing lights, ensuring the first aid kit was fully stocked. The other drivers often teased him about his thoroughness, but Marcus had seen too many preventable accidents during his EMT days to take any shortcuts when children's safety was involved. Pine Ridge Elementary School stood as a testament to Cedar Valley's commitment to education. Built in the 1970s but recently renovated, the single-story brick building featured large windows that flooded classrooms with natural light, and a playground that had been updated through community fundraising efforts. The school served about 300 students from kindergarten through 5th grade, small enough that most teachers knew every child by name, even those not in their classes. Marcus had been driving the Pine Ridge route for 7 years now, watching children grow from nervous kindergartners to confident 5th graders ready for middle school. He'd developed a reputation among parents as someone who went above and beyond, walking younger children to their doors during the first week of school, waiting to ensure kids got inside safely during bad weather, and maintaining order on the bus without ever raising his voice. His calm demeanor and fair approach earned him respect from even the most challenging students. It was this attention to detail, this habit of truly seeing each child, that made Marcus notice when Sophie Carter first started exhibiting unusual behavior. The academic year had begun normally enough in late August, with Sophie boarding the bus at the Riverside apartment stop on Aspen Street. She was a quiet child with mousy brown hair, often pulled back in a simple ponytail, hazel eyes that seemed too serious for a 7-year-old, and a slight build that made her appear younger than her 2nd grade classmates. During the first weeks of school, she'd sat near the middle of the bus, usually alone, clutching a worn purple backpack that looked too big for her small frame. The change had been gradual at first. Marcus noticed Sophie choosing seats closer, to the front, then standing for a few moments before sitting as if the seat was uncomfortable. By the 3rd week of September, she'd stopped sitting altogether. While other children chatted with friends, played quiet games, or dozed against windows, Sophie stood in the aisle, gripping the back of seats or the overhead rails, swaying with the motion of the bus like a tiny sailor on a ship. "Sophie, honey, you need to sit down while the bus is moving," Marcus had said. The first morning he noticed her standing for the entire ride. "It's safer that way." Sophie had looked at him with those too serious eyes and nodded but remained standing. "I'm okay, Mr. Marcus. I like standing." Safety regulations were clear. Children needed to be seated while the bus was in motion. But something in Sophie's expression, a flicker of what looked like fear when he suggested sitting, made Marcus hesitate to insist. He'd compromised by having her stand directly behind his seat, where he could steady her if needed, and made a mental note to mention it to her teacher. Grace Williams had been teaching 2nd grade at Pine Ridge Elementary for 15 years. With graying hair she wore in a neat bob and reading glasses perpetually perched on her nose, she embodied the perfect blend of kindness and structure that 7-year-olds needed. When Marcus mentioned Sophie's standing behavior to her during morning drop-off, Grace had frowned thoughtfully. "She's been different since school started," Grace had confided. "Very quiet, even for Sophie. She's always been reserved, but lately she seems worried. I've tried reaching out to her mother, but haven't gotten a response yet." The Riverside apartments, where Sophie lived, sat on the older side of Cedar Valley, near the river that gave the complex its name. The 3-story buildings, painted a fading beige, housed mostly working families and elderly residents on fixed incomes. While not the newest or most luxurious accommodations in town, the apartments were generally well-maintained, with small playgrounds between buildings and mature trees providing shade in summer. Marcus knew Sophie lived with her mother, Rachel Carter, and her stepfather, Derek Carter. He'd met Rachel briefly at the beginning of the school year, a tired-looking woman in her early 30s who worked as a cashier at the local grocery store. She'd seemed distracted during their interaction, offering only quick smiles and hurried responses to his welcome. Derek Carter was newer to the picture, having married Rachel over the summer. Marcus had seen him only once, a tall man with close-cropped hair who worked construction, according to the emergency contact forms. As September progressed into October, the Colorado mountains burst into their annual display of gold and crimson. The morning air grew crisp, requiring jackets and sometimes gloves for the wait at bus stops. Marcus noticed Sophie's clothing seemed Inadequate for the dropping temperatures, the same thin windbreaker every day, no gloves despite the frost on morning grass. Her standing behavior continued, becoming more pronounced. She'd grip the seat back so tightly her knuckles would turn white, and she'd shift her weight constantly, as if finding a comfortable position was impossible. Other children on the bus began to notice too. Tommy Chen, a third grader who lived in the same apartment complex, had asked one morning, "How come Sophie never sits down, Mr. Marcus?" "Everyone's different, Tommy," Marcus had replied, but the question gnawed at him. In his years of driving, he'd seen children act out for attention, deal with anxiety about school, or struggle with changes at home. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But Sophie's behavior felt different. There was something desperate about the way she avoided sitting, something that triggered his old EMT instincts. The breakthrough in understanding came on a particularly cold Tuesday morning in early October. Sophie had boarded the bus wearing the same thin windbreaker, her hands red from cold. As she took her usual standing position behind Marcus's seat, he noticed her wince as she gripped the metal rail. "Sophie, are you hurt?" he asked gently, catching her eye in the rearview mirror. "No, Mr. Marcus," she replied quickly, but he caught the way she shifted her weight, favoring her left side. That morning, Marcus made a decision. After completing his elementary route, instead of taking his usual coffee break at the depot, he drove to Pine Ridge Elementary and asked to speak with Principal Linda Reyes. A former teacher herself, Linda ran the school with a combination of efficiency and warmth that made her beloved by staff and students alike. "I'm concerned about Sophie Carter," Marcus explained, sitting in her office surrounded by children's artwork and motivational posters. "She refuses to sit on the bus, seems to be in discomfort, and I've noticed other signs that worry me: inadequate clothing for the weather, apparent physical discomfort, and a general fear response to normal situations." Linda's expression grew serious as she listened. "Grace Williams has expressed similar concerns. Sophie's been having difficulty sitting at her desk too, often asking to stand while working. We've tried contacting her mother but haven't had much success. The family moved here over the summer, so we don't have much history with them." "What about the stepfather, Derek Carter?" Marcus asked. "We've had virtually no contact with him. He's listed on the emergency forms, but all communication has been with Mrs. Carter, and even that's been minimal." Linda paused, choosing her words carefully. "Have you noticed any visible injuries?" Marcus shook his head. "Nothing obvious, but her behavior suggests physical discomfort. In my experience as an EMT, children who avoid sitting often have injuries to their lower back, buttocks, or thighs. The fact that she's standing despite safety rules suggests the discomfort of sitting outweighs her natural desire to comply with authority." Linda nodded thoughtfully. "I think we need to have the school nurse do an assessment. Would you be willing to write up your observations for our records?" "Of course," Marcus agreed. "I've been keeping notes already." That afternoon, when Marcus arrived for his route, he learned that Diane Foster, the school nurse, had attempted to examine Sophie during lunch. The attempt hadn't gone well. According to Grace Williams, Sophie had become extremely upset when asked to remove her jacket for a basic health check, crying and asking to call her mother. The incident had been concerning enough that Linda Reyes had made the decision to contact Child Protective Services for guidance. The next morning, Wednesday, Sophie wasn't at her usual bus stop. Marcus waited an extra 5 minutes, watching the entrance to the Riverside apartments, but she never appeared. Tommy Chen boarded alone, shrugging when Marcus asked about Sophie. "I didn't see her this morning, Mr. Marcus. Her mum's car was gone when I left." The absence worried Marcus more than her presence had. He completed his route with a growing sense of unease, the empty space where Sophie usually stood seeming to mock his concerns. Had the family been alerted to the school's interest? Had they decided to keep Sophie home? At Pine Ridge Elementary, he learned that Sophie was indeed absent. Grace Williams pulled him aside during morning drop-off, her face etched with worry. Linda called CPS yesterday afternoon. They were supposed to do a welfare check today. Sophie's absence feels intentional. Marcus felt his old EMT instincts screaming that something was very wrong. He'd seen enough domestic situations to know that abusers often isolated their victims when outside interest was shown. The fact that Sophie had been kept home the day after the failed nurse examination was a red flag he couldn't ignore. "I'm going to drive by their apartment," he told Grace, "just to see if everything looks okay." It was against protocol. Bus. Drivers weren't supposed to make unscheduled stops or check on students outside of their routes. But Marcus's concern for Sophie outweighed procedural rules. After completing his morning elementary route and before starting the middle school pickup, he drove his personal truck to the Riverside Apartments. The complex was quiet in the late morning, most residents at work or school. Marcus parked across the street from Building C, where the Carters lived in apartment 204. Rachel's car, an older blue sedan, wasn't in its usual spot. But a pickup truck with construction equipment in the bed sat near the building entrance, likely Derek's vehicle. Marcus sat in his truck for several minutes, debating his next move. He had no authority to knock on their door, no official reason to be there. But his years of emergency response had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct was telling him Sophie was in danger. As he wrestled with the decision, movement caught his eye. The door to apartment 204 opened, and Derek Carter emerged. Marcus had seen him only in passing before, but now he observed the man more carefully. Derek was tall and muscular, his construction work keeping him in shape. He moved with the confident stride of someone used to physical labor. But there was something in his expression, a hardness around his eyes, that made Marcus grip his steering wheel tighter. Derek walked to his truck, tossing a gym bag in the passenger seat before driving away. Marcus waited until the truck disappeared around the corner before making his decision. He pulled out his phone and called the school. "Linda, it's Marcus. Thompson. I'm at the Riverside Apartments. Sophie's absent, her mother's car is gone, but I just saw the stepfather leave. I have a bad feeling about this." "Marcus, you shouldn't be there," Linda said, concern evident in her voice. "CPS is handling it. They've scheduled a visit for this afternoon." "This afternoon might be too late," Marcus replied, his EMT experience making him bold. "You didn't see her yesterday, Linda, the way she winced, the fear in her eyes. Something's happening to that little girl." There was a pause before Linda spoke again. "I've already called Detective Rodriguez at Cedar Valley PD about the situation. She's familiar with CPS cases. Maybe you should talk to her." Marcus ended the call with Linda and immediately dialed the police department. When Detective Sarah Rodriguez answered, he quickly explained his concerns and observations. Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran of the force, listened without interrupting. "Mr. Thompson, I understand your concerns. We're aware of the CPS referral and are coordinating with them. But without evidence of immediate danger, we can't force entry to check on the child." "What constitutes immediate danger?" Marcus asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "Does she have to be actively screaming for help?" "I know it's frustrating," Rodriguez replied, "but we have to follow protocol. CPS will—" A sound interrupted the conversation. A child's cry, faint but distinct, coming from the direction of Building C. Marcus's head snapped toward the apartment complex, his phone still pressed to his ear. "Did you hear that?" he asked Rodriguez. "Hear what, Mr. Thompson? Where exactly are you?" But Marcus was already out of his truck, moving toward the building. The cry came again, louder this time, definitely from the second floor. His EMT training. He kicked in, overriding every other consideration. "I'm at Riverside Apartments, Building C. he told Rodriguez, taking the stairs two at a time. I hear a child crying from apartment 204. It sounds like distress, not normal crying. Mr. Thompson, do not approach that apartment. I'm dispatching units now. Stay where you are. But Marcus had reached the second-floor landing. The crying was clearer now, accompanied by another sound that made his blood run cold. The voice of an adult, low and angry, though he couldn't make out the words. He moved closer to apartment 204, his phone still connected to Rodriguez. Detective, I'm outside the apartment. I can hear a child in distress and an adult voice that sounds threatening. I'm calling 911 for immediate response. We're already en route. ETA 3 minutes. Do not engage, Mr. Thompson. Marcus ended the call with Rodriguez and dialed 911, his hands steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through him. As the dispatcher answered, a sharp crack echoed from inside the apartment, followed by a child's scream, unmistakably Sophie's voice. 911, what's your emergency? This is Marcus Thompson. I'm at Riverside Apartments, Building C, apartment 204. I can hear a child screaming inside. There was what sounded like someone being struck. The child is in immediate danger. Sir, are you able to see inside the apartment? No, but I can hear... Marcus was cut off by another scream, this one wordless and filled with pain. Without thinking, he pounded on the door. Sophie, Sophie, are you okay? The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by shuffling sounds and heavy footsteps approaching the door. Marcus stepped back, his EMT training warring with his protective instincts. The door flew open, revealing Derek Carter, his face flushed with anger. What the hell are you doing here? Derek demanded, his large frame filling the doorway. Over Derek's shoulder, Marcus could see into the apartment. Sophie sat on the floor of the living room, her face streaked with tears, one hand pressed to her cheek. Her shirt was torn at the shoulder, and even from the doorway, Marcus could see bruising on her thin arms. I heard screaming, Marcus said, trying to keep his voice calm while speaking loud enough for the 911 dispatcher to hear. Is Sophie okay? She's fine. Kids cry. Now get lost before I... Mr. Marcus? Sophie's small voice cut through Derek's. Threat. She struggled to stand, wincing as she did so, and Marcus's heart clenched as he realized why she'd been standing on the bus. Bruises in various stages of healing covered the backs of her legs, visible below her shorts. Sophie, honey, are you hurt? Marcus asked, taking a step forward despite Derek's blocking presence. Derek moved to shut the door, but Marcus wedged his foot in the frame. The police are on their way, he said firmly. I suggest you step back and let them handle this. Derek's face contorted with rage. You called the cops? You have no right. The sound of sirens interrupted him, growing louder as multiple units approached. Derek's expression shifted from anger to calculation, and for a moment, Marcus thought he might try to run. Instead, he grabbed Sophie's arm, roughly pulling her behind him. She fell, Derek said quickly. Kids fall all the time. She's clumsy. Sophie whimpered as Derek's grip tightened on her arm, and that small sound of pain triggered something primal in Marcus. Without fully considering the consequences, he pushed past Derek into the apartment. Let her go, he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of his EMT days. Sophie, come here, sweetheart. The apartment was in disarray, furniture overturned, dishes broken on the kitchen floor. Sophie looked between the two men, fear evident in her tear-stained face. Then, with a burst of courage that took Marcus's breath away, she wrenched free from Derek's grip and ran to Marcus, wrapping her thin arms around his legs. Please don't let him hurt me anymore, she whispered, her voice muffled against his jeans. The words seemed to break something in Derek. He lunged forward. Whether to grab Sophie or attack Marcus was unclear, but Marcus instinctively turned, shielding Sophie with his body. Derek's fist connected with Marcus's shoulder instead of its intended target, At that moment, Cedar Valley police officers burst through the open door, weapons drawn. "Everyone freeze! Hands where we can see them!" The scene that followed was controlled chaos. Derek was quickly subdued and handcuffed, though not without resistance. Sophie clung to Marcus, refusing to let go, even as EMTs arrived to examine her. Detective Rodriguez appeared, taking in the scene with professional efficiency. "Mr. Thompson, we need to get Sophie to the hospital for examination," Rodriguez said gently. "Can you convince her to go with the EMTs?" Marcus knelt beside Sophie, his voice soft. "Sophie, these people are here to help you. They need to make sure you're okay. I'll come with you if they'll let me. All right?" Sophie nodded, her grip on Marcus's hand painfully tight. As the EMTs led them toward the ambulance, she finally spoke the words that would haunt Marcus for months to come. "He made me stand in the corner for hours when I was bad. My legs hurt so much. On the bus, sitting hurt too much because of what he did. Standing was the only thing that didn't hurt." The examination at Mountain View Medical Center revealed the full extent of Sophie's abuse. Dr. James Mitchell, the pediatrician who examined her, emerged from the room with a grim expression. "She has extensive bruising on her buttocks, lower back and thighs, consistent with being beaten with a belt or similar object. Some bruises are weeks old, others fresh. There are also signs of prolonged standing as punishment, edema in her lower extremities, stress markers on her feet. This child has been systematically abused for months." Detective Rodriguez documented everything meticulously. "Where's the mother in all this?" As if in answer, Rachel Carter burst through the emergency department doors, her face a mask of confusion and fear. "Where's Sophie? They said she was hurt? I was at work, I don't understand." The conversation that followed revealed a woman who had been living in her own form of fear. Rachel broke down as she learned the extent of Sophie's injuries, admitting that Derek had become increasingly controlling and violent since their marriage. She'd tried to leave twice, but had been too afraid, too isolated. "He said he was disciplining her," Rachel sobbed. "He said I was too soft, that Sophie needed structure. I never saw him hit her, I swear. I didn't know. Oh God, I didn't know it was this bad." The investigation that followed painted a disturbing picture. Derek Carter had a history of domestic violence in 2 previous relationships, information that had somehow never come up in background checks. He'd isolated Rachel from her family, controlled their finances, and used sophisticated psychological manipulation to maintain control. Sophie's journal, found hidden under her mattress, contained heartbreaking entries about the punishments she'd endured, standing in corners for hours, being forced to kneel on rice, beatings for minor infractions like spilling milk or speaking too loudly. The standing on the bus hadn't been a choice. It had been the only position that didn't cause excruciating pain from the beatings. The legal proceedings moved swiftly. Derek Carter was charged with multiple counts of child abuse, assault, and domestic violence. He was denied bail and remained in custody awaiting trial. Rachel, after extensive investigation, was placed in a diversion program that included mandatory counseling and parenting classes, with Sophie temporarily placed in foster care while the courts determined the best arrangement for her safety. Marcus found himself deeply involved in the aftermath. He testified about his observations, provided detailed documentation of Sophie's behavior changes, and became an unexpected advocate for improved recognition of abuse signs among school personnel. The case led to new training protocols for Cedar Valley School District employees, with Marcus helping to develop observation guidelines based on his experience. 3 months after that terrible October morning, Marcus received permission to visit Sophie in her foster home. The Washingtons, an experienced foster family who lived on the other side of Cedar Valley, had created a safe, nurturing environment where Sophie could begin to heal. When Marcus arrived, he found Sophie in the backyard, playing with the Washingtons' golden retriever. She looked up as he approached, and for the first time since he'd known her, her smile reached her eyes. "Mr. Marcus!" she called out, running to greet him. The difference was remarkable. Her cheeks had filled out, her posture was straight but relaxed, and most importantly, she moved without the careful, pained movements he'd observed for so long. "Hi, Sophie. You look like you're doing well." She nodded enthusiastically. "I am. Mrs. Washington is teaching me to bake cookies, and Mr. Washington is helping me with my reading. And look," she plopped down on the grass beside the dog, then bounced back up. "Sitting doesn't hurt anymore." The simple statement delivered with such joy brought tears to Marcus's eyes. They spent an hour together, Sophie chattering about her new school, her therapy sessions where she drew pictures and talked about her feelings, and her hopes that her mother would get better so they could be together again. As Marcus prepared to leave, Sophie hugged him tightly. "Thank you for noticing," she whispered. "Nobody else saw that I was hurting." The drive home was emotional for Marcus. He thought about all the children who rode his bus, about the responsibility he carried not just for their physical safety, but for their overall well-being. His experience as an EMT had taught him to recognize medical emergencies, but Sophie had taught him that sometimes the most critical interventions happened not in ambulances, but in the everyday moments of paying attention. The case had ripple effects throughout Cedar Valley. The school district implemented new training programs for all staff, focusing on recognizing signs of abuse and the proper channels for reporting concerns. Marcus became a regular speaker at these trainings, sharing his story and emphasizing the importance of trusting instincts when something seems wrong. The community rallied around Sophie and other vulnerable children, establishing a new fund to provide emergency assistance for families in crisis and expanding counseling services at the schools. The local churches organized support groups for survivors of domestic violence, and the police department increased their collaboration with social services. Derek Carter was eventually convicted on all charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. During the trial, 2 previous victims came forward, inspired by Sophie's courage to share their own stories of abuse at his hands. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, particularly noted the systematic nature of the abuse and Derek's pattern of targeting vulnerable single mothers and their children. Rachel Carter underwent intensive therapy and parenting classes. The court monitored her progress closely, requiring supervised visits with Sophie initially. The reunion was cautious but hopeful, with both mother and daughter working with therapists to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of trust and safety. A year after that fateful October morning, Marcus stood before a packed auditorium at the annual Cedar Valley School District Conference. He'd been invited to share Sophie's story with permission as part of a presentation on student safety and welfare. "We often think of our roles as narrowly defined," he told the assembled teachers, administrators, and support staff. "Bus drivers drive, teachers teach, nurses treat injuries. But Sophie taught me that our most important role is simply this: to see the children in our care, really see them, notice when something changes, trust our instincts when something feels wrong, and most importantly, act on those instincts." He paused, looking out at the attentive faces. "Sophie stood on my bus for 3 weeks because sitting was too painful. It was such a small thing, easily dismissed. She could have been labeled as defiant or attention-seeking. Instead, by paying attention to that one unusual behavior, we uncovered a situation that could have ended tragically." The presentation continued with specific guidance on observation techniques, reporting procedures, and the importance of documentation. But Marcus knew the most important message was simpler. Every child deserves someone who will notice when They're hurting and take action to help them. 6 months later, Sophie returned to Pine Ridge Elementary. The Washingtons had become her permanent guardians, adopting her with Rachel's blessing after it became clear that independent living wasn't yet safe for mother and daughter. Rachel remained in Sophie's life through regular supervised visits, both committed to building a healthier relationship. Marcus was there the morning Sophie stepped back onto bus 47. She paused at the entrance, looking up at him with those serious hazel eyes that now held warmth instead of fear. "Good morning, Mr. Marcus," she said clearly. "Good morning, Sophie. Welcome back." She walked down the aisle with confidence, choosing a seat near the middle, sitting down without hesitation. As Marcus watched in the rearview mirror, she pulled out a book and settled in for the ride, just another second grader heading to school. The route continued as it always had, through the subdivisions, past downtown, into the older neighborhoods. Marcus greeted each child by name, noticed who seemed tired or upset, who forgot their lunch money, who might need an extra smile or word of encouragement. His vigilance had become second nature, as automatic as checking his mirrors or stopping. At railroad crossings, at Pine Ridge Elementary, as the children filed off the bus, Principal Linda Reyes caught Marcus's eye and nodded, a simple gesture that acknowledged everything they'd been through, everything they'd learned, everything that had changed. Because one bus driver noticed a little girl who wouldn't sit down. Sophie was the last to exit, as had become her habit. She paused beside Marcus's seat, looking up at him with a smile. "See you this afternoon, Mr. Marcus." "See you this afternoon, Sophie." As he watched her skip toward the school entrance, backpack bouncing with each step, Marcus reflected on the profound responsibility and privilege of his position. He wasn't just transporting children from one place to another. He was a guardian, a protector, a witness to their lives. Sometimes that meant simply making sure they got to school safely. Other times, it meant recognizing when a child's whole world was unsafe and having the courage to act. The sun climbed higher over Cedar Valley as Marcus put the bus in gear and headed toward the middle school for his next route. In the distance, the Rocky Mountains stood sentinel over the town, their peaks catching the morning light. The radio played softly, classic rock this morning, and the familiar rhythm of the route resumed. But Marcus Thompson was forever changed. Every child who stepped onto his bus was somebody's Sophie, someone who deserved to be seen, to be heard, to be protected. His EMT training had taught him to save lives in moments of crisis. His experience with Sophie had taught him that sometimes lives were saved simply by paying attention. The story of the bus driver who noticed when a little girl wouldn't sit down became legend in Cedar Valley, shared at school board meetings, PTA gatherings, and new employee orientations. It served as a reminder that heroes don't always wear capes or carry badges. Sometimes they wear navy blue uniforms and drive yellow buses, and their superpower is simply caring enough to notice when something isn't right. Marcus continued driving Bus 47 for many years after, watching over generations of Cedar Valley's children. He kept a photo on his dashboard, not of Sophie to protect her privacy, but of an empty bus seat. It served as a daily reminder that every empty seat, every standing child, every unusual behavior could be a cry for help waiting to be heard. The impact of Sophie's case extended far beyond Cedar Valley. The story gained national attention, leading to improved training protocols for school transportation staff across the country. Marcus was invited to speak at conferences, sharing his experience and advocating for better recognition of abuse signs. But he always returned to his route, to Bus 47, to the children who depended on him not just for transportation, but for that extra layer of protection that comes from being truly seen. Years later, when Marcus finally retired, the school district held a ceremony in his honor. Hundreds of former students attended, many now adults with children of their own. Sophie, now a college student studying social work, gave the keynote speech. Mr. Marcus taught us all that safety isn't just about seatbelts and traffic rules, she said, poised and confident at the podium. It's about creating an environment where children feel seen, heard, and valued. He showed us that sometimes the smallest observations can lead to life-changing interventions. He saved my life not with dramatic heroics, but with simple attention and the courage to act on what he observed. The legacy of that October morning lived on in the policies and procedures implemented across the district, in the heightened awareness of all school staff, and in the lives of countless children who benefited from adults who learned to pay closer attention. But perhaps most importantly, it lived on in Sophie herself, a survivor who had found her voice and chosen to dedicate her life to helping other children find theirs. As the ceremony concluded and Marcus stood surrounded by well-wishers, he thought about all the mornings he'd driven through Cedar Valley, all the children he'd transported, all the small moments that had made up his career. He'd started as a bus driver looking for a job with good hours. He'd become a guardian, a protector, and ultimately an example of how ordinary people in ordinary jobs could make extraordinary differences in children's lives. The sun was setting over the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Somewhere in Cedar Valley, school buses were completing their afternoon routes, drivers watching their mirrors, noting which children seemed different today, staying alert for signs that someone might need help. The cycle continued. The vigilance remained, and children were safer because one bus driver had noticed when a 7-year-old girl couldn't bear to sit down. Marcus Thompson's story, and Sophie's, served as a permanent reminder that in the daily routines of life, in the seemingly mundane tasks of getting children to and from school, lay opportunities for profound impact. Every adult who worked with children carried the potential to be the one who noticed, the one who acted, the one who made the difference between suffering in silence and finding safety. The yellow buses of Cedar Valley continued their routes day after day, year after year. But they carried more than children now. They carried the legacy of vigilance, the power of observation, and the proof that sometimes the most important journeys weren't measured in miles traveled, but in lives saved. The October morning air carried an unusual chill as Marcus Thompson guided Bus 47 past the familiar landmarks of Cedar Valley. The golden aspens that lined Mountain View Drive seemed to shimmer with particular intensity, their leaves catching the early sunlight in a way that made the whole world appear gilded. Marcus had driven this route countless times, yet this morning felt different somehow, weighted with a significance he couldn't quite name. As he turned onto River Road, Marcus noticed Dr. James Mitchell's silver sedan parked outside Cedar Valley Medical Group earlier than usual. Through the clinic's large windows, he could see the pediatrician moving about, preparing for what would undoubtedly be a busy day. The sight triggered a memory from the previous week when Dr. Mitchell had conducted the school health screenings, his gentle manner putting even the most anxious children at ease. The bus depot supervisor, Frank Henderson, had mentioned something interesting during yesterday's drivers' meeting. Apparently, there had been an increase in calls from concerned parents about behavioral changes in their children. Nothing specific, just a general sense that kids were acting differently this fall. Marcus had filed the information away, adding it to his mental catalogue of community observations. The first stop of the morning route was at Cedar Heights, the newer development where mostly young families lived. The Johnson twins, Emma and Ethan, bounded onto the bus with their usual energy, their matching superhero backpacks bouncing as they claimed their favorite seats. Their mother, Patricia, waved from the doorway, her expression carrying that mixture of relief and worry that Marcus had come to recognize in parents, sending their children off for the day. "Morning, Mr. Marcus," Emma chirped, her gap-toothed smile infectious. "Guess what? We're getting a puppy this weekend." "That's wonderful news," Marcus replied, genuinely pleased. The normalcy of such announcements always grounded him, reminding him that despite the challenges some children faced, childhood joy still existed in abundance. As the route progressed through Cedar Valley's diverse neighborhoods, Marcus observed the subtle rhythms of the community. The early morning joggers on the river trail, the shop owners preparing to open along Main Street, the crossing guards setting up at Pine Ridge Elementary, all part of the intricate tapestry that made up small-town life. At the Meadowbrook Apartments, he picked up the Ramirez children, Maria, Jorge, and little Anna. Their grandmother, who cared for them while their parents worked early shifts at the hospital, always walked them to the bus stop, despite Anna's protests that she was big enough to walk by herself. The elderly woman's weathered hands would pat each child's head before they boarded, a blessing offered in Spanish that Marcus had learned meant, "Go with God." The social fabric of Cedar Valley revealed itself in these morning interactions. Marcus had become, over his years of driving, an informal keeper of community knowledge. He knew which families were struggling financially, which marriages were strained, which children were dealing with illness or loss. This knowledge wasn't gossip. It was the accumulated awareness of someone who paid attention, who cared about the well-being of those in his charge. At the Riverside Apartments, his collection of passengers grew to include several children from the lower-income section of town. Tommy Chen boarded with his usual quiet demeanor, followed by Ashley Martinez, whose mother worked 3 jobs to keep their small family afloat. These children often carried heavier burdens than their peers, and Marcus made sure to greet each one with particular warmth. The apartment complex itself told a story of economic disparity within Cedar Valley. While the mountain views were spectacular from every angle in town, the quality of housing varied dramatically. The Riverside Apartments, with their aging infrastructure and minimal maintenance, stood in stark contrast to the newer developments on the east side. Yet the children who lived here were no different from their more affluent peers. They carried the same dreams, faced similar fears, and deserved equal attention and care. As Marcus navigated through the older section of town, he passed the community center, where his friend Michael Torres ran after-school programs. The building, a converted church from the 1950s, had become a vital resource for working families who needed safe, affordable childcare. Michael had mentioned recently that they were seeing more children with behavioral issues, kids who seemed anxious or withdrawn. "Something's in the air this year," Michael had said during their coffee meeting last week. "Can't put my finger on it, but the kids seem more stressed than usual." Marcus had noticed it too, a subtle shift in the emotional temperature of his young passengers. Perhaps it was the economic uncertainty that had been affecting the region, with the local lumber mill announcing layoffs and several small businesses closing on Main Street. Children, despite adults' attempts to shield them, often absorbed the stress of their environments like sponges. The route took him past Cedar Valley Elementary's sister school, Pinewood Primary, where the youngest children in the district attended pre-K and kindergarten. The building, painted in cheerful primary colors, always made Marcus smile. It represented hope and new beginnings, the place where formal education started and where, ideally, every child had an equal chance to succeed. Grace Williams lived in a modest craftsman-style home 3 blocks from Pine Ridge Elementary. Marcus often saw her walking to school on pleasant mornings, her arms loaded with teaching materials. This morning, however, her car was in the driveway, and through the window he could see her at her kitchen table, surrounded by papers. Report card season was approaching, and dedicated teachers like Grace often worked late into the night, ensuring their assessments were thorough and fair. The social services building on Elm Street caught his attention as he passed. Brittany Power's car was already in the parking lot, unusual for this early hour. The young social worker had been putting in extra hours lately, dealing with what seemed to be an uptick in family crisis situations. The economic downturn was taking its toll, and often it was the children who suffered most when families faced financial stress. Marcus thought about the interconnected nature of the community support systems. Teachers like Grace, social workers like Brittany, medical professionals like Dr. Mitchell, law enforcement officers like Detective Rodriguez, all formed a network of adults dedicated to protecting and nurturing Cedar Valley's children. Bus drivers like himself were often the first line of observation, the ones who saw children daily and could notice when something changed. The Mountain View neighborhood, where many of the town's professionals lived, provided a stark contrast to the Riverside apartments. Here, well-maintained yards and two-car garages spoke of financial stability. The Hartley children waited at their stop with their nanny, a young woman from the Philippines who was working on her teaching credential. Even in affluent families, Marcus had learned, children could face challenges. Pressure to succeed, parents too busy with careers to notice emotional needs, or the isolation that sometimes came with privilege. As he turned onto School Street, the imposing facade of Cedar Valley Middle School came into view. Soon, the fifth graders on his bus would transition to this larger, more complex environment. Marcus always felt a twinge of concern when his elementary students moved on. The middle school years could be particularly challenging, and the protective bubble of elementary school would burst. The local radio station, KCDV, was running its morning news update. The announcer, Barbara Chen, Tommy's aunt as it happened, was discussing the upcoming city council meeting where budget cuts to social services would be debated. Marcus frowned, knowing how such cuts could affect the most vulnerable families in the community. The interconnectedness of Cedar Valley revealed itself in countless ways. The grocery store where Rachel Carter worked as a cashier was owned by the Patterson family, whose children Marcus had driven for 3 generations. The construction company where Derek Carter found employment was run by Stan Mitchell, Dr. Mitchell's brother. These connections could be supportive, creating a network of mutual aid, but they could also enable isolation when families fell through the cracks. Near the industrial part of town, Marcus passed the old textile factory that had been converted into artist studios and small businesses. This adaptive reuse project had been controversial initially, but was now seen as a symbol of Cedar Valley's ability to change with the times. Sarah Rodriguez's husband ran a woodworking shop there, creating custom furniture that sold to clients as far away as Denver. The diversity of Cedar Valley's economy was reflected in its children. Marcus transported the sons and daughters of teachers, police officers, shop owners, factory workers, artists, and professionals. Each child brought their unique family culture onto the bus, creating a microcosm of the larger community. The Cedar Valley Public Library, a beautiful Carnegie building from the early 1900s, stood proudly on Oak Street. The head librarian, Dorothy Wang, had instituted programs specifically for at-risk youth, providing not just books, but also a safe space after school. Many of Marcus's passengers spent their afternoons there doing homework or attending reading programs. As he passed the library, Marcus remembered a conversation with Dorothy about the importance of third places for children, locations beyond home and school where they could feel safe and supported. The library, the community center, even the school bus itself could serve this function, providing stability in unstable situations. The fire station, where several parents of his riders worked, displayed its flags at half-mast. Marcus made a mental note to find out why. Such details mattered in a small town where everyone was connected in some way. The firefighters often visited the elementary schools for safety programs, and the children who had parents in emergency services carried a particular kind of worry that Marcus had learned to recognize. The local newspaper office, home to the Cedar Valley Gazette, occupied a narrow building sandwiched between the hardware store and a new coffee shop. The Gazette's education reporter Jennifer Morrison had recently written a series on childhood trauma and its effects on learning. The series had sparked important conversations throughout the community about how to better support struggling children. As Marcus navigated the familiar streets, he reflected on how the physical geography of Cedar Valley created distinct neighborhoods with their own characteristics. The river served as both a natural boundary and a dividing line between the more affluent areas and the working-class neighborhoods. The mountains provided a stunning backdrop, but also isolated the town from larger urban centers, creating both a sense of community solidarity and limitation. The schools themselves served as community anchors. Pine Ridge Elementary, where Principal Linda Reyes had recently instituted new programs for social-emotional learning, was more than just an educational institution. It hosted community meetings, voting during elections, and summer programs that served as childcare for working parents. The contrast between different areas of town was particularly noticeable during Marcus's route. Some children boarded the bus with designer backpacks and the latest technology, while others carried hand-me-down bags and wore shoes that were clearly too small. Yet on the bus, these differences temporarily dissolved as children from all backgrounds shared the common experience of getting to school. The recent economic challenges had affected Cedar Valley in various ways. The tourism industry, which many families depended on, had seen a downturn. The local ski resort had shortened its season, affecting not just lift operators and hospitality workers, but the entire economic ecosystem that depended on tourist dollars. These changes rippled through the community, affecting everything from school funding to family stability. As he passed the small industrial park, where several manufacturing businesses operated, Marcus noticed fewer cars in the parking lots than in previous years. The economic shifts from manufacturing to service industries had hit towns like Cedar Valley particularly hard. Parents who had once held stable factory jobs now worked multiple part-time positions with unpredictable schedules, creating stress that inevitably affected their children. The importance of routine in children's lives became even more critical during uncertain times. Marcus understood that his consistent presence, his reliable schedule, and his steady demeanor provided an anchor for many children whose home lives might be in flux. The yellow bus arriving at the same time each morning represented predictability in an unpredictable world. The local churches played a significant role in the community's social safety net. Cedar Valley had congregations representing various denominations, and many ran food pantries, clothing drives, and support programs. The First Baptist Church on Maple Street operated a particularly active ministry for families in crisis, and Marcus knew several of his riders' families had benefited from their assistance. The mental health resources in Cedar Valley were limited, with only 2 practicing child psychologists and a small clinic that provided counseling services. The waiting lists were long, and many families couldn't afford private therapy even when it was available. This gap in services meant that teachers, school counselors, and even bus drivers often found themselves serving as informal mental health first responders. The seasonal nature of life in Cedar Valley also affected its children. The long winters could be particularly challenging for families living in poverty, with heating costs adding significant financial strain. Marcus had learned to watch for signs that children might be living in homes without adequate heat, wearing multiple layers even inside the bus, reluctance to remove coats at school, or frequent illnesses. The agricultural component of the local economy, while smaller than in previous generations, still influenced community rhythms. Several of Marcus's riders came from farming families who lived on the outskirts of town. These children often had responsibilities beyond their years, helping with livestock or crops before school. Their understanding of life's cycles and harsh realities was different from their town-dwelling peers. The role of extended families in Cedar Valley varied greatly among different cultural groups. The Latino community, which had grown significantly over the past decade, often had strong multi-generational households where grandparents played active roles in childcare. In contrast, many Anglo families were more nuclear, with grandparents living elsewhere or uninvolved in daily care. The local hospital, Mountain View Medical Center, served as more than just a healthcare facility. It was one of the largest employers in Cedar Valley and provided crucial services to the surrounding rural areas. The pediatric department, where Dr. Mitchell worked, had recently started a program to identify signs of abuse and neglect, training staff to recognize subtle indicators that might otherwise be missed. The school district's budget constraints had led to difficult decisions about resource allocation. Art and music programs had been reduced, class sizes had increased, and support staff positions had been cut. These changes placed additional stress on remaining staff and reduced the safety net for children who might need extra support. The geographic isolation of Cedar Valley, while contributing to its tight-knit community feel, also presented challenges. Specialized services often required trips to Denver or Colorado Springs, creating barriers for families without reliable transportation or flexible work schedules. This isolation could trap families in difficult situations with limited options for help. The changing demographics of Cedar Valley reflected broader national trends. The town had become more diverse over the past 2 decades, with new immigrant families adding to the cultural tapestry. This diversity enriched the community, but also created challenges as systems adapted to serve families with different languages, cultures, and needs. The role of technology in children's lives had evolved dramatically during Marcus's years of driving. Where once children talked and played games during bus rides, many now sat absorbed in tablets or smartphones. This change had both positive and negative aspects. Technology could be isolating, but it also provided connections to resources and support that might not be available locally. The informal networks of information and support in Cedar Valley operated alongside official systems. Parents talked at soccer games, teachers shared concerns in the staff lounge, and community members watched out for each other's children. These informal networks could be powerful forces for good, but could also perpetuate problems when harmful behaviors were overlooked or excused. The economic divide in Cedar Valley was perhaps most visible in the different after-school experiences of children. Some went to enrichment activities, music lessons, sports teams, academic tutoring. Others went home to empty houses or to older siblings charged with their care. The community center and library tried to bridge this gap, but resources were limited. The impact of substance abuse on families was another underlying current in the community. The opioid crisis had not spared Cedar Valley, and Marcus had learned to recognize the signs of children dealing with addicted parents: irregular attendance, anxiety about going home, unusual hunger, or inappropriate clothing for the weather. The natural beauty of the area, while a source of community pride, could also mask serious problems. Tourists saw charming mountain vistas and quaint downtown streets, not the struggling families in substandard housing or the children going to school hungry. This disconnect between appearance and reality was something longtime residents like Marcus understood well. The agricultural heritage of the valley influenced community values in subtle ways. Self-reliance was prized, which could make it difficult for families to seek help when needed. The expectation that people should handle their own problems could leave children suffering in isolation, their struggles unseen by those who might help. The school system's attempts to address diverse student needs were well-intentioned but often inadequate. Special education resources were stretched thin, English language learning support was minimal, and programs for gifted students had been eliminated due to budget cuts. These limitations meant that many children's needs went unmet, despite the best efforts of dedicated staff. The seasonal employment patterns in Cedar Valley created particular challenges for families. Many parents worked multiple jobs during tourist season, then faced unemployment or reduced hours in the off-season. This instability affected children's lives in numerous ways, from inconsistent supervision to financial stress that permeated households. The role of law enforcement in the community extended beyond traditional policing. Officers like Detective Rodriguez often found themselves dealing with family crises, mental health emergencies, and child welfare issues. The small size of the force meant that officers developed deep knowledge of community members, which could be both an asset and a limitation. The healthcare system in Cedar Valley, while dedicated, faced significant challenges. The shortage of mental health providers meant that children with emotional or behavioral issues often went untreated. The nearest specialized children's hospital was hours away, creating barriers to care for families with complex medical needs. The community's response to crises could be both its greatest strength and its weakness. When faced with obvious emergencies, natural disasters, accidents, or public tragedies, Cedar Valley rallied remarkably. But the slow-burning crises of poverty, abuse, or neglect often went unaddressed until they reached breaking points. The educational attainment levels in Cedar Valley varied widely, affecting how families navigated systems meant to help them. Parents with limited education might struggle to advocate for their children in school settings or understand their rights regarding social services. This created another layer of vulnerability for already at-risk children. The housing situation in Cedar Valley reflected broader economic inequalities. While some families lived in beautiful homes with mountain views, others crowded into substandard apartments or aging mobile homes. The lack of affordable housing options meant that families often stayed in unhealthy or unsafe situations because they had nowhere else to go. The community's size meant that most people had multiple connections to others, as neighbors, co-workers, fellow church members, or sports team parents. These overlapping relationships could create strong support networks, but could also complicate professional boundaries and make it difficult to maintain confidentiality in sensitive situations. As Marcus completed another circuit of his route, he reflected on the complex web of relationships, resources, and challenges that shaped life in Cedar Valley. Every child who stepped onto his bus was influenced by these larger forces, their individual stories woven into the broader narrative of the community. Understanding this context was crucial for anyone hoping to make a difference in children's lives. The responsibility of being a mandatory reporter weighed heavily on Marcus and others who worked with children. Recognizing signs of abuse or neglect required not just observation skills, but also an understanding of the community context. What might be a warning sign in one family could be explained by cultural differences in another. The need for cultural competency had become increasingly important as Cedar Valley grew more diverse. The intersection of poverty and child welfare was particularly complex. Many behaviors that might trigger concern: children caring for younger siblings, missing school to help at home, or showing signs of neglect, were often symptoms of poverty rather than intentional abuse. Distinguishing between families needing support and those presenting danger required careful assessment. The role of the school system as a frontline identifier of children in crisis had expanded over the years. Teachers and support staff were expected to serve not just as educators, but as informal social workers, counselors, and sometimes the only stable adults in children's lives. This expansion of responsibilities came without commensurate increases in resources or training. The community's values around family privacy sometimes conflicted with child protection needs. The belief that family business should stay within the family could prevent people from reporting concerns or seeking help. Breaking through this cultural barrier required building trust and demonstrating that intervention was about supporting families, not punishing them. The foster care system in Cedar Valley, like many rural areas, faced significant challenges. There were never enough qualified foster families, meaning that children who needed placement might be sent far from their communities, schools, and support systems. This displacement could compound trauma and make eventual family reunification more difficult. The juvenile justice system intersected with child welfare in complex ways. Young people who acted out due to trauma or family dysfunction might find themselves labeled as delinquents rather than receiving the therapeutic interventions they needed. The small size of Cedar Valley meant limited options for alternative programs or specialized interventions. The impact of domestic violence on children was another crucial factor in the community. While services existed for adult victims, children who witnessed violence often received less attention. The long-term effects of exposure to domestic violence could manifest in various ways, from behavioral problems to difficulty forming healthy relationships. The role of substance abuse treatment in family preservation was critically important but underfunded. Parents struggling with addiction needed comprehensive support to maintain custody of their children, but treatment options in Cedar Valley were limited. The nearest inpatient facility was hours away, creating barriers to accessing care. The importance of early intervention couldn't be overstated. Programs that identified and supported at-risk families before crises occurred had shown promise, but funding for prevention was often the first to be cut during budget constraints. The community repeatedly found itself responding to emergencies that might have been prevented with earlier support. The legal system's approach to child welfare cases reflected broader societal tensions between family preservation and child safety. Judges and attorneys in Cedar Valley had to balance competing imperatives, often with limited information and resources. The small size of the legal community meant that conflicts of interest were common, complicating representation in family court matters. The community's efforts to address childhood trauma had evolved over the years. Training in trauma-informed care had been introduced in schools and social service agencies, helping professionals better understand and respond to children's needs. However, implementing these approaches consistently across all systems remained a challenge. The role of peer support for families navigating child welfare systems was increasingly recognized as valuable. Parents who had successfully reunified with their children or overcome challenges could provide unique insights and encouragement to others facing similar situations. Developing these peer support networks required intentional effort and resources. The intersection of immigration, status, and child welfare created particular vulnerabilities for some families. Fear of deportation might prevent undocumented parents from seeking help when needed, leaving children in potentially dangerous situations. Building trust with immigrant communities required culturally sensitive approaches and clear policies. About information sharing with immigration authorities. The importance of maintaining sibling connections in out-of-home placements was increasingly recognized. When children had to be removed from their homes, keeping brothers and sisters together could provide crucial emotional support and stability. However, the limited number of foster homes that could accommodate multiple children made this goal difficult to achieve consistently. The autumn wind whistled through the valley as Marcus guided Bus 47 past the old water tower that had served as Cedar Valley's unofficial landmark since the 1940s. The structure, painted with the town's name in fading blue letters, stood as a testament to the community's endurance through decades of change. Below it, the early morning traffic was beginning to build as residents started their daily routines. The complexities of small-town life revealed themselves in countless small ways. At the corner of Birch Lane and 3rd Street, Marcus noticed Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, the retired school principal, tending to her rose garden despite the cool morning air. She had been a fixture in Cedar Valley's educational system for 40 years before retiring, and even now, she kept watchful eyes on the neighborhood children who passed her house on their way to school. The local economy's struggles were evident in the increasing number of "for lease" signs in the downtown business district. The hardware store that had been run by the Patterson family for 3 generations had closed last month, unable to compete with the big box stores in the larger towns nearby. These closures rippled through the community, affecting not just the business owners, but their employees and the families who depended on those jobs. At the Riverside Apartments, maintenance issues had become more visible in recent months. The playground equipment showed rust and wear. The parking lot was riddled with potholes, and several units had boarded windows. The property management company, based in Denver, seemed to have little interest in investing in improvements for their lower-income tenants. The disparities in educational resources across different neighborhoods were subtle but significant. Children from the more affluent Mountain View area often arrived at school with new supplies, updated technology, and the confidence that came from educational support at home. In contrast, many children from the Riverside Apartments and similar areas made do with hand-me-downs and relied heavily on the school's free supplies program. The role of extended family support varied dramatically across the community. Some children benefited from involved grandparents, aunts, and uncles who provided additional care and stability. Others, particularly those from families dealing with substance abuse or mental health issues, had limited family networks and relied more heavily on community resources. The changing nature of employment in Cedar Valley had created new challenges for families. The gig economy had arrived even in this small town, with parents cobbling together income from multiple sources, driving for food delivery services, selling crafts online, or taking seasonal work at the ski resort. This patchwork approach to earning a living often meant unpredictable schedules and income, creating stress that inevitably affected children. The healthcare disparities in the community were particularly evident in children's dental health. While some children sported braces and had regular cleanings, others suffered from visible decay and untreated problems. The single pediatric dentist in town had a months-long waiting list for the sliding scale appointments that lower-income families could afford. The impact of technology on family life had created new forms of inequality. While some homes had high-speed internet and multiple devices, others relied on the library's computers or the school's loaner laptops for their children to complete homework. The COVID-19 pandemic had exposed these digital divides starkly, and while some improvements had been made, gaps remained. The food insecurity issues in Cedar Valley were often hidden but pervasive. The school's free breakfast and lunch programs were crucial for many children, and teachers had learned to stock drawers with granola bars and crackers for students who arrived hungry. The local food bank operated out of the Methodist Church basement saw increasing demand each month. The transportation challenges faced by families without reliable vehicles created additional barriers. Cedar Valley had minimal public transportation, just a small shuttle that ran limited routes during business hours. Parents without cars struggled to attend school events, medical appointments, or access services located across town. The role of faith communities in providing social support varied. While some churches actively engaged in outreach and assistance programs, others maintained a more insular focus. The divide between different denominations sometimes created parallel support, systems that didn't always communicate or coordinate effectively. The mental health crisis among youth had become increasingly visible. Self-harm, anxiety disorders, and depression were appearing in younger children, overwhelming the limited counseling resources available. The school counselors, stretched thin across multiple buildings, could provide only crisis intervention rather than ongoing therapeutic support. The involvement of fathers in children's lives showed significant variation across the community. While some families had highly engaged fathers who attended school events and coached sports teams, others were headed by single mothers with absent or minimally involved fathers. The reasons ranged from work schedules to incarceration to substance abuse issues. The impact of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, was becoming better understood in Cedar Valley thanks to training initiatives and awareness campaigns. However, translating this understanding into practical interventions remained challenging given limited resources and systemic barriers. The seasonal affective disorder that impacted many residents during the long winter months affected children as well as adults. The lack of sunlight, combined with limited indoor recreational facilities, could exacerbate existing mental health challenges and create additional stress for vulnerable families. The role of pets in children's lives was more significant than might be apparent. For some children, especially those dealing with trauma or family stress, a beloved pet provided crucial emotional support and stability. The local animal shelter had started a program allowing children to read to cats and dogs, combining literacy support with animal therapy. The community's response to natural disasters and emergencies revealed both strengths and weaknesses. When flooding had threatened the lower-lying areas near the river 2 years ago, neighbors had rallied to help evacuate families and provide temporary shelter. However, the long-term recovery exposed gaps in disaster preparedness, particularly for low-income families who lacked insurance or resources to rebuild. The educational aspirations within the community varied widely. While some families had multi-generational college attendance and high expectations for academic achievement, others viewed high school graduation as the end goal. These differing expectations influenced children's self-perception and motivation from an early age. The role of sports in Cedar Valley went beyond simple recreation. For many children, participation in school teams or community leagues provided structure, mentorship, and sometimes a path to college scholarships. However, the costs associated with equipment, travel, and fees created barriers for lower-income families. The community's size meant that reputation and family history carried significant weight. Children from families with negative reputations, whether due to criminal activity, substance abuse, or other issues, often faced prejudice and lowered expectations from community members who remembered their parents' or grandparents' struggles. The volunteer networks that supported various community programs relied heavily on retired residents and stay-at-home parents. As economic pressures forced more parents into the workforce and retirees faced their own financial constraints, finding volunteers became increasingly difficult. The impact of social media on children's mental health and social dynamics had become a growing concern. Cyberbullying, social comparison, and online predators were new threats that parents and educators struggled to address effectively. The small-town nature of Cedar Valley meant that online conflicts often spilled over into real-world relationships. The availability of enrichment activities varied dramatically by economic status. Piano lessons, art classes, summer camps, and other opportunities that could nurture children's talents and interests were often out of reach for families struggling to meet basic needs. The community center's after-school program had become a critical resource for working families. but funding constraints limited the number of children who could be served. The waiting list grew longer each year, leaving many children in unsupervised situations during the crucial hours between school dismissal and parents' return from work. The role of the library had expanded beyond traditional services. Librarians found themselves serving as informal social workers, helping families access online resources, providing safe spaces for children to do homework, and sometimes being the first to notice when a child was in distress. The intergenerational poverty that affected some families created cycles that were difficult to break. Children who grew up in households where no one had completed high school or held stable employment faced significant barriers to envisioning different futures for themselves. The support systems for children with special needs were particularly strained. While the school district was legally required to provide services, the reality often fell short of ideal. Parents frequently had to advocate aggressively for their children's rights, a process that required knowledge and persistence that not all families possessed. The impact of parental incarceration on children was another hidden issue in the community. With the nearest state prison about 2 hours away, maintaining family connections was challenging. Children with incarcerated parents often dealt with shame, financial hardship, and the trauma of separation. The community's relationship with law enforcement was generally positive, but tensions existed, particularly in neighborhoods with higher crime rates or among immigrant communities. Building trust between police and these communities required ongoing effort and sensitivity. The role of school resource officers had evolved over the years. While their presence was intended to enhance safety, there were ongoing debates about the appropriate balance between security and creating a nurturing educational environment. Some children, particularly those who had experienced trauma, found the presence of uniformed officers anxiety-provoking. The availability of fresh, healthy food varied by neighborhood. While the downtown area had a farmer's market and health food store, the neighborhoods where many low-income families lived were food deserts, with only convenience stores offering limited, expensive, and often unhealthy options. The impact of environmental factors on children's health was becoming better understood. The old mining operations that had once driven Cedar Valley's economy had left behind contaminated sites. While most had been cleaned up, concerns remained about long-term health effects, particularly in older neighborhoods built near former industrial areas. The community's efforts to address substance abuse had evolved from a purely punitive approach to one incorporating harm reduction and treatment. However, stigma remained strong, making it difficult for families affected by addiction to seek help openly. The role of peer pressure and social dynamics changed as children moved through different developmental stages. Elementary school children faced different challenges than middle schoolers, requiring age-appropriate interventions and support systems. The impact of poverty on educational outcomes was well documented, but difficult to address comprehensively. Children who came to school hungry, tired from living in chaotic households, or worried about basic needs, struggled to focus on learning. While teachers did their best to accommodate these challenges, the systemic issues remained. The availability of role models and mentors varied across the community. Some children had access to successful adults who could guide and inspire them, while others had limited exposure to possibilities beyond their immediate circumstances. The intersection of mental health and learning disabilities created complex challenges for some children. Distinguishing between behavioral issues stemming from trauma and those related to neurological differences required expertise that wasn't always available in the school system. The community's size meant that privacy was limited. Information about families' struggles often became public knowledge quickly, which could lead to either supportive intervention or harmful gossip, depending on the circumstances. The role of cultural traditions and heritage varied among different Groups in Cedar Valley, some families maintained strong connections to their cultural roots, providing children with a sense of identity and belonging. Others had assimilated more fully, sometimes at the cost of losing touch with their heritage. The impact of weather extremes on vulnerable families was significant. Harsh winters meant high heating bills, the need for warm clothing and transportation. Challenges. Summers brought different issues, including the loss of school meals and the need for childcare when school was out. The availability of mental health services specifically for children remained a critical gap. While adults could access counseling through various channels, specialized child therapists were rare and waiting lists were long. This meant that many children's mental health needs went unaddressed until they reached crisis levels. The role of grandparents in childcare had become increasingly important as more families required two incomes to survive. However, this arrangement could be stressful for older adults dealing with their own health issues and limited energy. The community's approach to discipline in schools had evolved over the years, moving away from purely punitive measures toward restorative justice practices. However, implementation was inconsistent, and some children continued to face harsh consequences for behaviors that might be symptoms of underlying trauma or disabilities. The impact of housing instability on children's education was profound. Frequent moves meant changing schools, losing friendships, and disrupting learning. The McKinney-Vento Act provided some protections for homeless students, but the definition of homelessness didn't always capture the full range of housing instability that affected children. The availability of extracurricular activities at school was limited by budget constraints and transportation issues. While sports teams received community support, other activities like drama, debate, or academic clubs struggled to find funding and participation. The role of school counselors had expanded dramatically beyond academic guidance. They were often the first responders to mental health crises, family emergencies, and disclosure of abuse or neglect. The ratio of counselors to students fell far short of recommended levels, limiting their effectiveness. The community's efforts to prevent substance abuse among youth included education programs and alternative activities. However, the availability of drugs and alcohol, combined with limited supervision for some children, made prevention challenging. The impact of perfectionism and academic pressure affected children across economic lines. While some struggled with basic skills, others faced intense pressure to excel, leading to anxiety and stress-related issues. The role of nature and outdoor activities in children's well-being was significant in Cedar Valley. Access to hiking trails, rivers, and open spaces provided opportunities for physical activity and stress relief. However, organized outdoor programs often required fees and equipment that excluded lower-income children. The community's response to the opioid crisis had included education, naloxone distribution, and attempts at treatment expansion. However, the impact on families continued to be devastating, with children losing parents to overdose or living with the chaos of active addiction. The availability of summer programs varied widely. While some children attended enriching camps or traveled with their families, others faced long, unstructured days with minimal supervision. The summer slide in academic skills was particularly pronounced for disadvantaged children. The role of the arts in education had diminished due to budget cuts, despite evidence of its importance for child development. Music, visual arts, and drama programs that had once been universal were now limited to schools that could fundraise for them or to families who could afford private lessons. The impact of social-emotional learning initiatives in schools was beginning to show positive results. Children were developing better vocabulary for expressing feelings and improved conflict resolution skills. However, these programs required consistent implementation and reinforcement at home to be truly effective. The community's size meant that most professionals wore multiple hats. Teachers might also coach sports. Counselors might run after school programs, and bus drivers like Marcus might serve as informal mentors. While this created opportunities for deeper relationships, it also risked burnout among overstretched staff. The role of standardized testing in shaping educational priorities had significant impacts on teaching and learning. The pressure to improve test scores sometimes came at the expense of creative or holistic approaches to education, particularly affecting schools serving disadvantaged populations. The availability of services for children with developmental disabilities varied. While early intervention programs existed for young children, services became scarcer as children aged. Families often faced difficult decisions about whether to keep children in the community or seek specialized programs elsewhere. The impact of family structure on children's well-being was complex. While stable two-parent households generally provided more resources, many single parents created nurturing environments despite challenges. Blended families faced unique dynamics as step-parents and step-siblings negotiated new relationships. The community's efforts to address racial and ethnic disparities in educational outcomes included cultural competency training and attempts to diversify staff. However, systemic barriers persisted, and children of color often faced lower expectations and harsher discipline. The role of preventive health care varied by family resources. While some children received regular checkups, vaccinations, and dental care, others accessed health care only in emergencies. The school nurse often served as the primary health screener for disadvantaged children. The availability of legal resources for families in crisis was limited. While larger cities had legal aid organizations, Cedar Valley families often struggled to access representation in custody disputes, protection orders, or other family law matters. The impact of witnessing community violence, while less prevalent than in urban areas, still affected some children. Domestic disputes, drug-related crimes, and occasional violent incidents left lasting impressions on young witnesses. The community's efforts to build resilience in children included various programs and initiatives. However, the concept of resilience could sometimes be used to place unfair expectations on children to overcome systemic disadvantages through individual effort alone. The role of school boards and educational policy-making reflected community values and priorities. Elections for school board positions could be contentious, with different visions for education competing for limited resources. The availability of translation services for non-English speaking families created barriers to engagement with schools and services. While the Hispanic population had grown significantly, institutional support for Spanish-speaking families remained inadequate. The impact of sleep deprivation on children's learning and behavior was increasingly recognized. However, addressing it required changes in family routines, school start times, and after-school activities that were difficult to coordinate. The community's relationship with nature provided both opportunities and challenges. While outdoor recreation was readily available, not all families had the transportation, equipment, or knowledge to access it safely. The role of informal childcare arrangements, including older siblings watching younger ones, neighbors helping out, and under-the-table babysitting, filled gaps in formal childcare but sometimes created safety concerns. The impact of advertising and consumer culture on children created pressures that affected self-esteem and family finances. The desire for brand-name clothing, latest technology, and other status symbols created stress for families struggling to meet basic needs. The availability of transportation for medical appointments, particularly specialized care in distant cities, presented significant challenges for families without reliable vehicles or flexible work schedules. The community's efforts to address bullying had evolved from a "kids will be kids" attitude to more systematic approaches. However, implementation varied, and cyberbullying presented new challenges that schools struggled to address effectively. The role of school meals in providing nutrition security had expanded during the pandemic with universal free lunch programs. The potential end of these programs created anxiety for families who had come to rely on them. The impact of learning loss during remote schooling periods continued to affect students, particularly those who had limited support at home or inadequate technology access. The availability of grief support for children who had lost family members was limited. While hospice organizations offered some programs, ongoing support for bereaved children often fell to overextended school counselors. The community's approach to sex education reflected cultural divisions, with ongoing debates about what should be taught and at what age. This sometimes left children without adequate information about their bodies and relationships. The role of community policing initiatives aimed to build positive relationships between law enforcement and youth. Programs like Coffee with Cops or youth police academies had mixed success, depending on community trust levels. The impact of housing quality on children's health was significant. Issues like mold, lead paint, inadequate heating, and pest infestations in older housing stock created health problems that affected school attendance and learning. The availability of respite care for families dealing with special needs, children or elderly relatives was minimal. This lack of support could lead to caregiver burnout and family stress that affected all family members. The community's efforts to celebrate diversity and promote inclusion faced both progress and resistance. While official programs promoted multiculturalism, informal social segregation often persisted. The role of social services in supporting families was complicated by high caseloads, paperwork requirements, and sometimes adversarial relationships between families, and the system meant to help them. As Marcus reflected on the complexity of issues facing Cedar Valley's children, he understood that his role as a bus driver placed him in a unique position. He was often the first adult to see children each day, the one who noticed changes in behavior or appearance that might signal problems at home. This responsibility weighed heavily on him, knowing that his observations could make the difference between a child receiving help or continuing to suffer in silence. The interconnected nature of all these community factors meant that addressing any single issue required considering the whole system. Poverty, mental health, education, healthcare, family stability, all were intertwined in ways that made simple solutions impossible. Yet within this complexity lay the opportunity for comprehensive approaches that could create real change for children, like Sophie Carter. The morning of October 15th arrived with an unseasonable warmth that seemed to mock the season's usual chill. Marcus Thompson adjusted his rearview mirror, catching sight of Sophie Carter in her usual position, standing rigidly in the aisle, her small hands gripping the seatbacks with white-knuckled intensity. 3 weeks had passed since he'd first noticed this behavior, and with each passing day, his concern had deepened into something that felt like a stone in his stomach. The other children had settled into their morning routines. Tommy Chen was reading a comic book, the Johnson twins were playing a quiet game of rock, paper, scissors, and Maria Ramirez was helping her younger brother Jorge with his spelling homework. But Sophie stood apart, isolated not just physically but emotionally, her eyes focused on some invisible point in the distance. As the bus rumbled past the old grain elevator on the outskirts of town, Marcus made a decision. He'd spoken with Grace Williams, Sophie's teacher, just yesterday, and her concerns had mirrored his own. Sophie had been asking to stand during class, claiming her chair was uncomfortable. She'd been wearing long sleeves despite the warm classroom, and her usual quiet demeanor had shifted into something more troubling, a kind of watchful silence that spoke of constant vigilance. "Sophie," Marcus called gently, meeting her eyes. "In the rearview mirror, you feeling okay this morning, sweetheart?" Sophie's gaze flickered to his for just a moment before returning to that thousand-yard stare. "I'm fine, Mr. Marcus," she whispered, but the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her words. As they approached Pine Ridge Elementary, Marcus noticed Principal Linda Reyes standing near the entrance, engaged in conversation with the school nurse, Diane Foster. Their serious expressions and the way they glanced toward the approaching buses suggested they were discussing something of importance. The morning drop-off proceeded as usual, but Marcus lingered, watching as Sophie descended the bus steps with careful, almost pained movements. She winced as her backpack shifted on her shoulders, and Marcus saw her reach back to adjust it, her face contorting briefly before she smoothed her expression into blankness. Grace Williams was waiting at the school entrance, and Marcus saw her eyes track Sophie's progress across the playground. The teacher's face reflected the same concern Marcus felt, and when their eyes met, she gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of their shared worry. Marcus completed his elementary route on autopilot, his mind churning through the observations he'd made over the past weeks. The way Sophie flinched when anyone came too close. The fear that flashed in her eyes whenever he suggested she sit down. The inadequate clothing for the increasingly cool mornings. The weight loss that made her already small frame seem almost fragile. Instead of taking his usual break at the depot, Marcus drove to Pine Ridge Elementary. He found Linda Reyes in her office, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a typical school morning. Phones ringing, teachers stopping by with questions, and the constant hum of activity that characterized the start of a school day. "Marcus," Linda said, looking up from her computer with surprise, "is everything all right?" "I need to talk to you about Sophie Carter," Marcus said without preamble. "Something's wrong, Linda. Very wrong." Linda's expression shifted immediately to one of focused concern. She closed her office door and gestured for Marcus to sit. Over the next 15 minutes, Marcus detailed his observations, the standing behavior, the physical discomfort, the fear response, the apparent bruising he'd glimpsed when Sophie's sleeve had ridden up yesterday. "Grace has similar concerns," Linda confirmed, her face grave. She tried to have Diane examine Sophie yesterday, but Sophie became extremely distressed, started crying, asking to call her mother. It was troubling. "What about the family situation?" Marcus asked. "What do we know about the home environment?" Linda pulled up a file on her computer, frowning as she reviewed it. "Mother is Rachel Carter, works at Patterson's Grocery. The stepfather, Derek Carter, is new to the picture. They married over the summer. He works construction with Mitchell Brothers. We've had minimal contact with him." "And before the marriage, any concerns about Sophie then?" "None," Linda said, shaking her head. "Sophie's always been quiet, but she was engaged, doing well academically. The changes started after school began this year, after the marriage." The implications hung heavy in the air between them. Marcus had seen enough during his years as an EMT to recognize the patterns. The timing of the behavioral changes, the physical symptoms, the fear response, all pointed toward a disturbing possibility. "We need to report this," Marcus said firmly. "To CPS, to the police. That child is being hurt." Linda nodded slowly. "I agree. I'll make the call to CPS this morning, but Marcus, She paused, choosing her words carefully. We need to be prepared for pushback. Without concrete evidence, without Sophie disclosing directly, it becomes more challenging. The evidence is there, Marcus insisted. You just have to look at her to see it. She can barely move without pain. She's terrified. How much more evidence do we need? I'm not disagreeing with you, Linda said gently. I'm just preparing you for the reality of how these cases often proceed. But you're right. We can't wait. I'll make the call now. As Linda reached for her phone, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He knew that reporting suspicions of abuse was just the first step in what could be a long, complicated process, but he also knew that doing nothing was not an option. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Marcus completed his middle school route, his mind constantly returning to Sophie. He thought about his own daughter, now grown and living in Denver, and how fiercely he would have protected her from harm. Every child deserved that kind of protection. By the time Marcus returned for his afternoon elementary route, the atmosphere at Pine Ridge had shifted subtly. Teachers moved with a kind of purposeful urgency, and Marcus noticed Detective Sarah Rodriguez's unmarked car in the visitor parking lot. Grace Williams caught him as he was preparing to load students. They're doing a welfare check tomorrow, she said quietly. CPS and the police. Sophie's absence today has everyone on edge. Absence? Marcus felt his stomach drop. Sophie wasn't in school today? Grace shook her head. No, and when the office called home, they got voicemail. Linda drove by the apartment during lunch. Rachel's car was gone, but there was a pickup truck there, probably the stepfather's. The afternoon route felt different without Sophie's presence. Her usual standing spot seemed to echo with absence, and several children asked where she was. Marcus gave non-committal answers, but inside, his worry was growing into something closer to fear. As he turned onto Aspen Street, approaching the Riverside apartments, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of simply driving past, he pulled the bus to the side of the road and put it in park. Everyone sit tight for just a minute, he told his passengers, ignoring protocol. As he stepped off the bus and walked toward Building C, he could see apartment 204 from the ground level. The blinds were drawn, unusual for the afternoon. No sounds came from within, no television noise or movement that would indicate normal activity. The pickup truck Grace had mentioned was indeed parked nearby, a newer model Ford with construction equipment in the bed. Marcus stood there for a moment, every instinct from his EMT days screaming that something was wrong. He thought about going back to the bus, continuing his route, following proper channels. But then he remembered Sophie's face that morning, the pain in her eyes, the way she'd whispered, "I'm fine," when she was anything but. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, his footsteps echoing in the concrete stairwell. As he approached apartment 204, he heard something that made his blood run cold, a child's whimper, soft but distinct, followed by a man's voice, low and angry. "Stop crying. You think crying's going to change anything? You brought this on yourself." Without thinking, Marcus pounded on the door. "Sophie? Sophie, are you okay?" The sounds from inside stopped abruptly. Heavy footsteps approached the door, and it swung open to reveal Derek Carter. Marcus had seen him only in passing before, but now, face to face, he took in the man's appearance. Tall, muscular, with close cropped hair and eyes that held a coldness that made Marcus's skin crawl. "What do you want?" Derek demanded, his body blocking the doorway. Over Derek's shoulder, Marcus could see into the apartment. Sophie was visible in the living room, sitting on the floor, her face streaked with tears. Even from the doorway, Marcus could see fresh bruising on her arms, and her shirt was torn at the shoulder. "I heard crying," Marcus said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I wanted to check if Sophie was all right." "She's fine. Kids cry. Now get lost." Derek started to close the door, but Marcus wedged his foot in the frame. "Sophie," Marcus called, out his voice louder now. "Sophie, honey, are you hurt?" Sophie looked up, and the hope that flashed in her eyes was quickly replaced by fear as she glanced at Derek. She struggled to stand, wincing visibly as she did so, and Marcus's heart nearly stopped when he saw the extent of the bruising on her legs. "Mr. Marcus." Sophie's voice was small, broken. She took a tentative step forward, and that's when Marcus saw it clearly, the way she moved, the careful way she held herself. He understood with sudden, terrible clarity why she'd been standing on the bus. Sitting would have been agony with those injuries. "Come here, sweetheart," Marcus said, extending his hand past Derek. Derek's face contorted with rage. "You need to leave, now, before you what?" Marcus asked, his own anger rising. "Before you hurt her more? I'm not leaving without her." The scene exploded into chaos. Derek grabbed Sophie's arm roughly, pulling her back. Sophie cried out in pain, and something inside Marcus snapped. He pushed past Derek into the apartment, his only thought to get Sophie away from this man. "Let her go," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying all the authority he'd learned during his years as an EMT. "Sophie, come to me." What happened next would be debated in court proceedings for months to come. Derek lunged forward. Whether to attack Marcus or grab Sophie more firmly was unclear. Marcus turned, instinctively shielding Sophie with his body. The little girl wrapped her arms around his legs, sobbing. "Please don't let him hurt me anymore," she whispered. And those 6 words would haunt Marcus for years to come. Derek's fist connected with Marcus's shoulder, sending pain shooting down his arm. But Marcus held his ground, one arm protectively around Sophie while he fumbled for his phone with the other. "I'm calling 911, he announced loudly. "The police are already on their way." As if summoned by his words, sirens became audible in the distance. Someone, probably one of his passengers' parents wondering why the bus was stopped, must have already called. The next few minutes were a blur of noise and movement. Police officers burst through the door, weapons drawn. Derek was subdued and handcuffed, despite his resistance. EMTs arrived, gently coaxing Sophie to let them examine her. Detective Rodriguez appeared, taking in the scene with professional efficiency. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of concern and mild reproach. "You want to tell me what happened here?" As Marcus recounted the events, Sophie clung to his hand, refusing to be separated from him even as the EMTs worked. Around them, her words came in fragments, each revelation more heartbreaking than the last. "He made me stand in the corner all night. I wasn't allowed to sit down. The belt, it hurt so much. Standing was the only thing that didn't hurt." Dr. Mitchell arrived at the scene, his face grave as he performed a preliminary examination. The full extent of Sophie's injuries would be documented at the hospital, but even the initial assessment was damning. Bruising in various stages of healing covered her lower back, buttocks, and thighs. Some injuries were weeks old, others fresh. "This is systematic abuse," Dr. Mitchell said quietly to Detective Rodriguez. "This child has been beaten regularly for an extended period." Rachel Carter arrived as Sophie was being loaded into the ambulance, her grocery store uniform wrinkled, her face a mask of confusion and fear. The conversation that followed revealed a woman living in her own kind of terror, isolated and manipulated by her new husband. "He said he was disciplining her," Rachel sobbed. "He said I was too soft, that she needed structure. I never saw. I didn't know it was this bad. Oh God, Sophie, I'm so sorry." The investigation that followed painted a disturbing picture. Derek Carter had a history of domestic violence in previous relationships, information that had somehow never surfaced. During background checks, he'd systematically isolated Rachel from her support system and used sophisticated psychological manipulation to maintain control. Sophie's journal, discovered hidden beneath her mattress, contained heartbreaking entries detailing the punishments she'd endured. Standing punishments that lasted hours, being forced to kneel on rice, beatings for minor infractions. The standing on the bus hadn't been a choice. It had been the only position that didn't cause excruciating pain. The legal proceedings moved swiftly. Derek Carter was charged with multiple counts of child abuse and assault. He was denied bail and remained in custody awaiting trial. The evidence was overwhelming. Medical documentation, Sophie's journal, witness testimony, and the observations of school personnel who had noticed the warning signs. Sophie's own testimony delivered via closed-circuit television to spare her. The trauma of facing Derek in court was powerful in its simplicity. When asked why she'd kept silent for so long, her answer broke hearts throughout the courtroom. He said no one would believe me. He said they'd take me away from Mommy. I just wanted the hurting to stop. The case sent ripples through the Cedar Valley community. Training programs were implemented for all school personnel, focusing on recognizing signs of abuse. Marcus became an unofficial spokesperson for vigilance, sharing his story at conferences and training sessions. "We all have a responsibility," he would say, "to see the children in our care, really see them, to notice when something changes, to trust our instincts when something feels wrong, and most importantly, to act on those instincts." The recovery process for Sophie was long and challenging. She was initially placed in foster care while Rachel underwent intensive therapy and parenting classes. The Washingtons, an experienced foster family, provided Sophie with the stable, nurturing environment she needed to begin healing. Marcus visited regularly with permission from social services. The first time he saw Sophie at the Washingtons' home, 3 months after that terrible October day, the change was remarkable. She ran to greet him, her movements free of the careful, pained quality he'd observed for so long. "Mr. Marcus," she called out, her smile genuine and bright. "Look, I can sit down now. It doesn't hurt anymore." The simple statement, delivered with such joy, brought tears to Marcus's eyes. They spent the afternoon talking, Sophie chattering about her new school, her therapy sessions where she drew pictures and talked about feelings, and her hope that her mother would get better so they could be together again. The community rallied around Sophie and other vulnerable children. A fund was established to provide emergency assistance for families in crisis. Mental health services were expanded. Churches organized support groups for survivors of domestic violence. The police department increased collaboration with social services. Derek Carter was eventually convicted on all charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. During the trial, 2 previous victims came forward, inspired by Sophie's courage, to share their own stories. The judge noted the systematic nature of the abuse and Derek's pattern of targeting vulnerable single mothers and their children. Rachel Carter underwent intensive therapy, gradually rebuilding her life and her relationship with Sophie under careful supervision. The reunion was cautious but hopeful, with both mother and daughter committed to healing. 1 year after that, pivotal October morning, Marcus stood before a packed auditorium at the annual Cedar Valley School District Conference. He'd been invited to share Sophie's story as part of a presentation on student safety and welfare. "Sophie taught me that our most important role is simply this," he told the assembled educators and support staff. "To see the children in our care, to notice when something changes, to trust our instincts, and to act on those instincts, even when it's difficult or goes against protocol." Sophie eventually returned to Pine Ridge Elementary, adopted by the Washingtons with Rachel's blessing, when it became clear that independent living wasn't yet safe for mother and daughter. Rachel remained in Sophie's life through supervised visits, both working toward a healthier relationship. The morning Sophie stepped back onto bus 47, Marcus felt a complex mix of emotions. She paused at the entrance, looking up at him with those serious hazel eyes that now held warmth instead of fear. "Good morning, Mr. Marcus," she said clearly. "Good morning, Sophie. Welcome back." She walked down the aisle confidently and chose a seat near the middle. As the bus pulled away, Marcus watched in the rearview mirror as she settled in, pulling out a book. Just another second grader heading to school. Years later, when Marcus retired, the ceremony in his honor was attended by hundreds of former students. Sophie, now a college student studying social work, gave the keynote speech. Mr. Marcus showed us that safety isn't just about seatbelts and traffic rules, she said, poised and confident. It's about creating an environment where children feel seen, heard, and valued. He saved my life not with dramatic heroics, but with simple attention and the courage to act. The legacy of that October morning lived on in the policies implemented across the district, in the heightened awareness of all school staff, and in the lives of countless children who benefited. From adults who learned to pay closer attention, the yellow buses of Cedar Valley continued their routes, carrying not just children, but also the profound reminder that in the daily routines of life lay opportunities for extraordinary impact. Marcus Thompson's story served as proof that heroes don't always wear capes or badges. Sometimes they wear navy blue uniforms and drive yellow buses, and their superpower is simply caring enough to notice when something isn't right. In a world where children too often suffer in silence, one bus driver's refusal to look away had made all the difference. As Cedar Valley moved forward, the community carried with it the hard-learned lessons of Sophie's case. Every adult who worked with children now understood that they might be the one person positioned to notice, to act, to save a life. And in that understanding lay the hope that no child would have to stand in pain, alone and afraid, waiting for someone to see their suffering and have the courage to help. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.